Lennis, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone that's joining us here. And also a big thanks to Jason, Mike, Seth, Lennis that I just mentioned, and for the rest of the team for putting together this summit together. I mean, you guys have been awesome. Like everything's on time. Like there's people watching, so this is great. And as Lennis just mentioned, I'm Kevin.
And I'm Carmen.
Yep, and we are Kind of Cooking.
Well, welcome to our presentation for the Sous Vide Summit. We are so happy that you're here.
Yeah, and so we got our sous vide like in 2015, and we love like all kinds of kitchen gadgets. The sous vide really opened a whole new world of culinary adventures for us. We spent like hours researching, we spent hours testing and cooking, and like a couple minutes eating, like scarfed it down. But through our adventures, we noticed that there's a lack of content in the sous vide Asian community. So there are dishes that can be adapted and simplified and probably improved with the use of a sous vide. And in hopes of filling that void, we are here to share our recipes with you. And we kind of started Kind of Cooking. Yeah.
Well, first of all, we're not chefs or scientists, but we love finding ways to improve our dishes. So what makes the sous vide work well with Asian dishes? Well, first thing, it makes it easy. A lot of Asian dishes are made standing by the stove, requiring your constant attention. It requires heat control, so in Chinese that's called 火候, the control of the fire. The reason why Chinese stir fries are so tender is because of the high heat, and that might be difficult to achieve at home. With the sous vide, you can achieve the tenderness and then use some sort of finishing step to create that crust or texture on the outside. It also takes all the guesswork out. You don't have to worry about overcooking or undercooking your meats. And in some cases, it offers superior textures to the meat.
Mm-hmm. And so like a good example of this is our first recipe that we've ever tried, and it was the famous Chinese barbecue pork recipe. Like this is the quintessential Chinese dish. Like the meat is sweet, it's salty, it's tender, it has like a nice bit of char on it, and like everyone knows what this tastes like and what it's supposed to taste like. And it's not a particularly hard dish to make. So why do we want to adapt it to the sous vide? Well, because we were able to achieve like textures in the pork that we otherwise wouldn't be able to easily get using traditional methods. In Chinese cooking, usually or rarely you get like medium food or rare meats. But cooking this pork shoulder at a lower temperature, it was literally the best barbecue pork we've ever had, and like it's one of the best dishes that we actually make it regularly, and we hardly ever do that. So as Lennis had mentioned earlier, like if at any point you guys have any questions, just put them in the questions and we'll try and get to them, or we'll get to them all at the end.
All right, so what do we look for when we adapt dishes for the sous vide? It needs to check a few of these boxes. Does it help us achieve some of the harder to master cooking techniques? Does it improve the texture of the dish? Does it make it easier? Now, not all Asian dishes work in the sous vide. There are many different cooking methods in Chinese cuisine or in Asian cuisine. Just in Chinese cooking alone, there are about 30 different methods used. And today we're going to go through all of them. I'm just kidding. We don't have the time for that. So some of the common ones are stir frying, deep frying, steaming, braising, and there are just so many others that don't even have English translations. We find that dishes that are poached, braised, grilled, deep fried, they work very well with the sous vide. And of course, with so many methods, we haven't tried everything yet, but these are good ones to stick with. Mm-hmm.
And so a good example of like one of the dishes that we poached is Hainanese chicken. And so for Hainanese chicken, it looks really simple, but there's more to it than meets the eye. Like there needs to be multiple layers of textures. Like the skin needs to be silky, it needs to have a good bite, and the meat needs to be tender and smooth.
And this texture combination alone has a name in Chinese, 皮爽肉嫩. The rough translation is skin crunch, meat tender. And to clarify, the crunch here is not like a potato chip crunch. Mm-hmm. It's more like a Japanese seaweed salad type of crunch. And that's the general goal you're aiming for when making Hainanese chicken. Hainanese chicken by itself is not eaten for its flavor, and that's why you have the 3 dipping sauces on the side. It is prized for its texture And it all comes down to temperature and timings. If you ever tried poaching a bird in your wok, it's not the most fun thing to do. You need to keep it moving, you hold the neck up, and you keep like scooping it up. And it's just, you try not to break the skin, and you try to maintain the correct temperature and cooking times. For our Hainanese chicken and actually soy sauce chicken, we found that the sous vide was such a good way to get the perfectly cooked chicken. We basically didn't have to do anything. It really takes out the stress of the whole recipe.
Mm-hmm. And like, I guess you can't really tell from the picture, but we actually cooked this chicken whole. I know some of you guys don't like to do that. I know some people are freaking out, but we do like to cook the whole bird, mainly because that's how you would traditionally get it. And when you buy it, it's also auspicious in Chinese culture to have the whole bird. But if you want to control, like if you want the control and you want to take advantage of the sous vide, you can definitely separate the whites and the darks, but do whatever makes you happy. And so the other thing is, when we cooked in the sous vide, we cooked at 160 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 hours in a broth. We found this temperature best replicated the traditional meat. It was tender, but not overly soft. It had a good bite, but it was not overdone. The one thing to note when you're cooking a whole bird like this is that you need to fill the bag with enough liquid so it fills the cavity. Like, air is not a good conductor of heat. So if you left it in there and you just put it in with no water, there's a high possibility or a high chance that it's still going to be raw inside.
Yeah. Well, with the meat texture taken care of, the skin is next. When you first take it out of the sous vide, the skin is quite delicate and soft. It's not yet the texture we're looking for. So we dump the chicken into an ice bath to immediately stop the cooking process. And we all know what happens in cold water. The next step is to air dry the chicken to give the skin the bite. Now, in doing these two finishing steps, it would achieve the ultimate hallmark of perfect Hainanese chicken, what we call the flavor jelly. And this is the gelatinous layer between the skin and the meat. Mm-hmm. So this is one of those dishes that we probably won't go back and doing the traditional way because it's just so much simpler and easier to do with the sous vide.
Yeah. What liquid do you suggest in the sous vide bag? We'll get to that. But it's basically chicken broth, and the rest of it is added as the essence from the chicken. So that's the quick answer, John. And thank you for subscribing, I think it says Jessica. So let's go back to this. The next thing we're going to talk about is sauces. So when you use sauces in the sous vide, the quantities are going to need to be adapted. There's no evaporation in the bag, so actually it has both its pros and the cons. The pros is that you can use a lot less liquid. Some of these sauces are going to be expensive, and you can get away with just a fraction of the amount you would if you were sous videing it. So, and you probably don't want to use that like bottle of premium soy sauce. It's like that stuff that my parents hid in the really back of the cabinet so we would accidentally use it. It's actually like a first press, kind of like a extra virgin olive oil, the first press of an extra virgin olive oil. So yeah, you want to use a lot less than that. And I guess you will probably get, the other thing is you get purge in the bag, directly in the bag, right? So that's the other positive. And that gives it an amazing meat flavor. But that comes with a downside. It's going to dilute that cooking liquid and flavoring. So let's take braising, for example, right? When you're cooking down on the stove, it's going to have a lot of evaporation when that concentrates the flavoring of the cooking liquid or sauce. But when you sous vide, the liquid from the meat is being added, so it actually dilutes the flavor. And like some of our recipes, like the soy sauce chicken, the Taiwanese beef noodle soup, the braised beef shank, the char siu, all of that takes that into account.
And a great example of this is Dong Po Ro. Story time. So Dong Po Ro is a famous Hangzhou dish named after the Song Dynasty poet and gastronome Su Dongpo. I guess he's a very talented guy because he also helped figure out how to stop flooding in Hangzhou. So the people there were so grateful that they gifted him a lot of pork. He wanted to share with everybody, so he asked his home cook to cut it up into little cubes and gift it with wine. Now, the cook misunderstood what he said and cooked the pork with the wine. And this might be the best culinary mistake ever because it turned out to be so delicious. It is now one of the must-eat dishes during festivities and celebrations.
Yeah, and like when we first had the dish, we knew we wanted to adapt this to the sous vide. Like the meat, it needs to be like soft, it needs to be tender, it needs to be butter-like. And I guess a very important part of this dish is the consistency between the meat and the fat. The fat can't be oily, it needs to not be greasy. So those are really important things. But sorry, back to it. There's a few things we need to keep in mind when adapting this dish. Traditionally, you would need to add enough water into the pot to cover it and cook it and steam it. But when you make it in the sous vide, you don't need to add that much water, and you need to take that into account because you're cooking this in a vacuum environment, and so that purge or the juices from the pork belly is going to release along with the fat. So basically, you can start these sauces stronger and allow them to dilute, kind of the opposite to traditional cooking.
And as we mentioned in the story before, this recipe calls for quite a bit of wine, but alcohol reacts differently in the sous vide environment. The first few experiments were basically not edible because of the alcohol content. Since there's no evaporation happening in the sous vide, the flavors were very sharp. And to get past this, the best way is to reduce the amount and cook off the alcohol before adding it in. But try not to burn down the house while you're doing that.
Dude, I was skinny there.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I guess from that you get a lot of these recipes. You get like purge in the bag. Purge sounds like a really gross word. I don't like using that word. I like to call it liquid gold because that is what it is. And if you haven't been saving these juices from your bags already, you should start. You definitely need to start doing that. And going back to our Hainanese chicken recipe, we use a broth that we cook that we poach the chicken in to make the rice. And because of the sous vide environment, all the chicken essence went into that broth and then into the rice, so it's never going to be wasted.
And in our Dongporo recipe, that purge was used to make the sauce. Since the sauce flavors were already salty enough after cooking, we didn't cook it down any further. Instead, we added cornstarch to it to thicken it up, and that sauce was absolutely amazing. It was rich, sweet, salty, and it has this meaty flavor in there because of the purge, and it's just so good with rice. Mm-hmm. With other braising or poaching liquids that are strong enough, you actually can reuse it. For the Japanese char siu pork, that's the one that you have with ramen, for that poaching liquid, we actually use it to marinate eggs afterwards. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that the second poach won't be as strong. And one of the other things I like to do with the purge or the liquid gold is to use it as a sauce base for stir fries.
Yeah. So, like, I guess the most interesting way that we've used this purge so far is we use it as a soup base, basically. That's actually one of my favorite recipes that we did. We tried to recreate a $400 bowl of beef noodle soup.
400 USD. 400
USD. Sorry, we're Canadian. 400 means like 600-700 here. Just kidding. Yeah. So, and we had the pleasure of trying it at New Papa in Taiwan. It's like the most expensive beef noodle soup in the world, and they're using like cuts of Wagyu. They're using beef from all around the world, like Canada, Australia, Japan. And they cook it in like a 3-day process. And I remember going there and I'm like, this is intense. This is a lot of work. And so we tried to recreate it. Obviously, ours doesn't look as good as theirs. It's not $400. But I feel like it was pretty successful. The meat was so moist. It was tender. And like, it was much cheaper. Could have bought the store with the $400. But I have to admit theirs was a little better. Just slightly. And so back to this thing, the soup base. The cooking liquid we used was like really strong. It was really flavorful. It was really bold. And it was based on soy sauce. We used soy sauce and strong spices like star anise, cinnamon, cloves, cardamom. And we sous vide the beef shank and short rib for 24 hours in that liquid. So you can bet that thing was going to be good. It was really strong. So to balance the flavors, and to bring it to the next level, really, we added clear bone broth just so we can make it. And then so that's our final product there that you see with the beef shank, the short rib, the noodles, the preserved vegetables. So the lesson here is to save all of those liquids. Like there's so many uses for it, no matter what dish you're making. But there is a couple of things to keep in mind. The first one is that we always strain our liquid through a fat separator. Sometimes there's too much fat in it. It's going to be too greasy in your mouth. And the other thing is you can cook it, or you can boil it, bring it to a boil, or use the microwave, and then strain out the solids. You don't want to keep those. It doesn't make anything look good. So those are 2 tips for you to do when you're trying to keep the purge.
Mm-hmm. And while we were experimenting with our previously mentioned barbecue pork recipe, we tried to use the same amount of marinade as the normal recipe called for, and we found that having more marinade in the bag didn't exactly yield more flavorful results, and that the texture of the meat was more mushy and softer, and it didn't char up as we would like on the grill, probably because it absorbed too much liquid. Now, in a more traditional setting, in the oven or on the grill, moisture dissipates, which means that what's left of your sauce and spices sticks to your meat. With sous vide cooking, there's no way for that moisture to escape the bag. Meanwhile, the flavoring of the surface of the meat tends to get rinsed off by the meat juices being squeezed out.
Mm-hmm. And so when we actually use less marinade for our recipes, like we're not talking about the ones that we had to poach or braise because those need a lot of liquid. But when we use less marinade, we have much better results. The flavor was better, the meat was more tender, and during the finishing step, it was just much easier to deal with. And I guess the other one just had too much liquid, but you can add the rest of the flavoring when you're finishing, right? So we always brush on a couple more layers of marinade. We let that, we put in the oven, in the hot oven, we brush on a couple layers, let that dry, put on another layer, finish it off with more marinade. So there's always a way to add that flavor afterwards instead of putting it in the bag. And in case you're wondering, we took the bag liquid from that barbecue pork and we boiled it off, and then we use it as a sauce on top. And we don't do that just for our barbecue pork. We also take a similar approach with our chicken. For our chicken, we've been putting a lot less things in the bag. The last couple we did was tandoori chicken and Korean fried chicken. Instead of overpowering the meat at the sous vide stage, we went a lot lighter on the marinade. We concentrated on flavors that would just give it a little bit of a kick and bring it to the next level when you bite into it, and also things that would make it more tender. Like we added some pickle juice, or we added some kimchi juice, more acidic things to tenderize the meat. And so we added the heavy flavors afterwards, and that all came in the finishing step.
Even though we keep our sous vide steps simple, we often use ginger, scallion, and garlic. This is the holy trinity of Chinese cuisine. It helps to remove some of the undesirable gaminess of the meat and add that distinct Chinese food flavor. And we know that garlic isn't generally recommended in the sous vide. However, we are cooking at temperatures high enough and with times that won't really support the growth of bacteria. And with recipes that use a lot of dry whole spices, we first put them in the little small spice bag, so you don't have to have weird little spice marks or dents on your meat after the sous vide, and you don't have to pick them out afterwards.
Or spit them out halfway through eating.
Yeah.
I think for me, that always ruins a meal. When you bite into that spice, that kills me every time. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is finishing. We're almost there, don't worry. So there's so many different ways to finish your dish, and this always brings it to the next level. So we always try and do that, but there are some that we don't have to do anything.
Yep, and that's actually my favorite. This is no finishing at all, ready to go. You can eat these straight out the bag. These are usually braised, poached, or steamed dishes that were adapted. For example, the soy sauce chicken and the black bean ribs. The black bean ribs especially, you can literally pour it out of the bag and it looks like that, and you can eat it.
Yeah, and so my personal favorite is, as you can tell, deep frying. It makes a bit of a mess, but it's okay. And the beautiful part of combining the sous vide with the deep fryer is removing any guesswork. It's ready. You just watch the color. The color's good. It's crispy enough. You're done, right? You remove it right after that. And so a small tip, I prefer to cool my meat before frying it. I find this helps in sticking the breading. And it also gives you a bit more time to brown before overcooking. And you can probably use an air fryer. We don't personally have one, but it's basically just a small convection oven.
And speaking of the oven, we did our Cantonese pea pod duck in there to achieve that crispy skin. This recipe is traditionally poached, then roasted, so doing it in the sous vide was a natural fit. After the sous vide, we salted the skin, rubbed it with vinegar, and air dried it overnight in the fridge. This makes sure all the water content is sucked out and the skin is nice and dry for the crisping. The next day, we popped it into the oven and cranked it up as high as we possibly could. We actually didn't use the broil function because for chicken or duck skin, it tends to burn quite easily and can cause holes. And to take it even further, you can also ladle hot oil over it slowly, but don't completely submerge it in the oil because that doesn't create the right texture. It kind of just bubbles up and breaks up the skin.
Mm-hmm. And so there's a couple of dishes that we're not totally proud of. Well, not totally proud of, but I feel like it didn't come to what we expected. And one of those was the crispy pork belly skin. What we were hoping for was like really tender meat, melts in your mouth, but with like a really light, very crispy skin. And to create that, usually you would get like you would need it to be very dry. And cooking the pork belly in the sous vide caused it to be a little bit too moist, and I feel like this hindered our crispening process. We poked a lot of holes into it. We salted heavily. We left in the fridge overnight to dry, and before putting it in the hot oven. While this did help, we feel like that some parts were a little bit more leathery, although some parts were crispy. But if we were, for us, like when we make these recipes, it needs to actually bring it like to the next level. Like it needs to be at least better than the store-bought version. So we're going to continue to refine that one and try and figure out how to best do that.
Mm-hmm. Then there's stir frying. This is where we sauce it up. Since the meat is cooked, we can concentrate on creating that final flavoring and sauce. This step is going to be quick, and for some of these dishes, this is actually a multi-step. Our General Tso's chicken is one of these recipes. We cooked it in the sous vide for the perfect meat texture. We deep fried it for the crispiness. Then we cooled it a little bit so it doesn't steam itself. Then we stir fried it for the saucy goodness. Now, I know this sounds like a bit of work, but like I said at the very beginning, if you don't have that super jet engine high heat wok burner, these layers of textures might be hard to achieve. Also, we like to use these type of dishes to meal prep since the longest part, the cooking, is already done, so we just need to finish it off for quick dinners throughout the week. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of other steps, other ways to finish as well, like grilling or blowtorch. And usually we crank it up as high as possible to get that beautiful sear on the meats.
Right, and just going back really quickly to the meal prep, because we're kind of running out of time. When we do sous vide, we actually sous vide some extra. And after we do that, we give it a quick chill and we put it in our freezer so it's ready like whenever you want, because you don't want to always be waiting 8 hours or whatever. You can just quickly re-warm it up for an hour or so and you're finished it off. But anyhow, with all of these recipes we mentioned, they're all in our blog, they're all on our YouTube channel. You can connect with us on Instagram, on Facebook, leave us comments on YouTube. But yeah, anything you need, just give us a shout.
Ask us a question right now.
Yeah, ask the question.
Yeah, this was great, guys. Thank you so much for sharing this very valuable information. We have a question from Patty. There's talk about turching. Do you brush with oil? Do you ever get an off taste if you don't use the right part of the flame?
So that's a great question. So in most cases, to be honest, although I really like it, I try and stay away from the flame burner. I really prefer doing it on the grill or in the oven or on a pan. That I feel like that eliminates any of that. But yes, if you're using the flame, you want to be a little further back and be like right into it all the time. And do I brush it with oil? Yes, I do brush it with oil most of the time. But it really just depends on what we are making. Like last night, we had some older sous vide smoked ribs. We put it in the freezer. We sous vide it to make for dinner last night, and we brushed on some barbecue sauce and just gave it a little bubble, and that was it. And I saw some other questions, like we are from Toronto, for someone who was asking. Thank you all for subscribing to our YouTube channel. And I think someone gave a much better answer than I could with the garlic. But okay, so for garlic, there's a couple of things. Like with garlic, if you put it in the sous vide bag, the one thing aside from the bacteria is that it's going to taste more raw. And in some dishes, that's okay. Like for the barbecue pork dish, not barbecue pork dish, the ribs dish, the black bean ribs, the garlic is traditionally like more raw, as bigger chunks. So it works pretty well in that. But we also reduced the amount of garlic, and we probably didn't mention that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, everyone. We have some wonderful questions. You guys did an amazing job. We still have a couple more minutes to get your questions answered right here by these two sous vide with an Asian flair expert. That's what I'm going to call you. People are, definitely subscribing to your YouTube channel and definitely learning a lot and enjoying your recipes because they not only teach them something but make them laugh. So that's wonderful to see and to read. What projects are you guys working on? That would be my question.
Oh, okay. So we put a little post out yesterday with sous vide eggs. So that's kind of what we were working on for the last little bit. It's really, really simple, but it really brought it to the next level. And if you guys want to see that, you have to watch that on our video next week. But aside from that, we are actually trying to figure out the pork dish. And I'm really curious with the sous vide pork and the pork belly and how to really improve that and bring it to the next level.
Yeah, we were thinking about basically buying a big slab and cutting it up into different pieces and doing basically a different temperature and different timings for each one of them, because for pork belly, there's so many different ways to prepare pork belly for for Asian culture, like even whether Japanese or Korean or Chinese, doesn't really matter, and they all have different textures. Just like the sous vide is great for the don poro because it's a braised dish and it's wet and moist, but it's maybe not that great for the roast pork. So we want to figure out what's the best temperature and times for the different texture profile that you're looking for. But that's a really lengthy experiment, and there'll be a lot of pork belly to eat.
Yeah, so we have another question coming in from Thiago, who did an amazing job last night teaching us how to do some nice cocktails. So did you do a whole sous vide chicken?
Yes, we've done it several times actually. We've done whole sous vide chicken. We did that with our soy sauce chicken and the Hainanese chicken. Those were both whole chickens.
We also did a whole duck. Yeah,
we did a whole duck, and we've done a whole turkey. And those two were completely spatchcocked and open because they're a little bigger and you want it to cook through. So the other ones are if you're using broth, you have to fill it, as I mentioned. And if you're spatchcocking it, you don't need to worry as much. Just make sure it's cooked through.
And if you haven't seen it yet, I do highly recommend watching the Cantonese pipa duck. It's actually a little different from the regular roast duck that you see on the shops, because the pipa duck is actually a more difficult method to prepare it. It's more flavorful actually. And then the way that it's spatchcocked is not how Western cooking spatchcocks it. You would go through the spine and take out the spine. But for the Chinese way of spatchcocking, it goes to the chest. So none of the bones or anything are wasted. And it opens up into an interesting shape that looks like a pipa. Well, pipa is actually an ancient Chinese instrument, kind of like, I guess quickly to say, like a guitar, kind of looking like that. But it's named after that because it looks like that.
Right. And I see a bunch of questions about soy sauces. We do not keep our soy sauce in the fridge. It's fermented. It's not going to go bad. It can live in there for years.
Yeah, the ones that are naturally fermented, it's outside in a giant urn vat thing. And so they're used to all the natural causes, rain, snow, whatever.
Yeah. And something more about the soy sauces. There are a lot of soy sauces. I forgot which episode we spoke about that really briefly.
Soy sauce chicken.
Soy sauce chicken, yes. There's a lot. Like there's just rows of soy sauces where we are. You can go in and get lost in that aisle. You have like the lower end stuff, which is like third or fourth price, and then you have like the really premium stuff that's like the first price. That is the good stuff. And usually you just use that for flavoring and not so much for cooking.
Well, thank you guys so much for all your help. Yeah, we are closing up. We have about a minute left here. I just want to remind everyone to join us for our lunch session. We have Chef Eric Villegas for Sous Vide Juicy Lucy. And then we also have an advanced lunch option with Chef David, which I'm sure is going to be quite incredible as well. So thank you again, everyone. And if you have a few more questions, I gotta hop out, but these guys can stay on for a couple more minutes before one of our friends from the summit staff actually comes in and closes the session. So thank you guys. Great job.
Thank you very much, Lennis.
Bye.
All right. thank you all for joining. And we hope to talk to you or hear from you guys in any of our platforms.
Yep, I put the link to our YouTube channel on the chat. So please subscribe and
Come check us
comment there. And also we're on Instagram all the time.
It's a lot of clapping. Thank you guys. So do we just stand here now or what do we do?
I think someone's supposed to come and kick us out.
Okay, we'll wait for them to kick us out then.
Let's see, where are you guys from? I didn't get to see the comments while we were talking. California, Florida, Dallas, Texas, Orlando. Lots
Utah.
Ooh. Where's Rio Rancho?
Vancouver.
Boston.
Florida.
Tell us a joke.
Tell us a joke. Am I not already here? Come on.
Wow, Spain. Delaware, San Diego, Virginia, Minnesota, Colorado. Oh, thank you guys for joining us. This is our, actually second live talk. We had one with Jason Lodgton on their Facebook, but this is like a bigger one.
What is our favorite dish that we've adapted from?
I like the roast duck.
I like the roast duck. I also like the barbecue pork.
Yes.
That one, like, usually you don't, like, if you watch the video, those are actually our genuine reactions to it. That's the first time we tried it. That was the first dish we've ever tried, and it was really, really good.
And Chinese barbecue pork is a Cantonese dish. I am Cantonese, so I've been eating it all my life. And I have to say, I'm not like just saying because we made it. It is the best barbecue pork I've ever eaten. I'm actually quite critical of the food that we make ourselves, so I can vouch for that.
Yeah, we've even had it like in other places. We traveled just to go find some barbecue pork, and so far that has been our favorite.
Mm-hmm.